Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Hidden History. As you can tell, this will be about Guatemala. Very, very excited for today's episode. But as I was recording the episode, I recorded it originally all in one go. I looked at the time, and it was an hour and 6 minutes. It's way too long for a Hidden History episode. You know you're busy. You got to keep it in good, easy, digestible parts. Today's episode, we will focus on the build-up, the lead-up, and the circumstances that led to the original coup, the Jacobo Arbenz overthrow in 1954. Some really important, critical circumstances to get into, and really wanted to dive deep into this issue. So I thought, what better way to do it than breaking it up into two parts rather than just shoving an hour and 6 minute monstrosity, which I still think is pretty good, but just super, super long down your throats. So without further ado, here is the original first half of the hour and 6 minute full episode, which the second part, of course, will be coming next week. Hello, everybody, and on last week's episode of Hidden History, we set the groundwork. We revealed the framework of interests, of people, of playbook, the way coups would work, and it all took place in Iran with the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. Well, it was time to go to Latin America. Because on today's episode of Hidden History, we take you to Guatemala, where in 1954, there was a democratically elected Guatemalan president, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who wanted to do something pretty simple: establish democracy and end the years-long, decades-long rule of the United Fruit Company and other American-backed interests. I'm sure you can imagine just how that went, but, if you've read your history, he was obviously, overthrown, but that does, make this episode just that much more interesting, especially if you don't know, because it was a pretty important coup, really a coup that, first it was kind of with the British, it was kind of with the kind of, international community. Last week we talked really about the big role the British played in overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran. Well, this was all an American operation, and it really did show in a large way, really, just how much and the lengths we would go to really defend our kind of special interests and our, not even any kind of direct national security interest. This was literally just for the profits of a fruit company, and also really this kind of mindset that was really developing, this Cold War mindset, this really imperialistic mindset that we've seen from the likes of, maybe the British Empire in the past, this feeling that, frankly, Americans owned the world, especially the Americans at the top of the political food chain. This kind of mindset, as this owning the world mindset, frankly, it goes back to something that you probably have heard of if you are kind of recently have been in a kind of an American, maybe late middle school, early high school history class, the Monroe Doctrine. And of course, essentially the Monroe Doctrine was pretty simple. It said United States pretty much down to do whatever it wants in Latin America. This is kind of also weirdly framed, I think, by some as especially some of my teachers, like, they just wanted what's best for Latin America. They wanted to get in there, and they didn't want Europe messing around with these young countries who had, if you look at it from a certain angle, if you tilt your head a little bit, have kind of been in a similar place, in a similar situation to the United States not too far back. They're a young country kind of shaking off colonialism, and they just needed all the best support and all the best help that they could in kind of achieving these goals. And that really wasn't what it was. It was obviously about power. It was about the ability to, the United States really recognizing that there was a lot of money, there was a lot of power to be had in the control of really this region and a massive just continent of the United States. They didn't really have the power early on, obviously, to enforce this doctrine, but over time, it was pretty clear that they were able to essentially, especially as European powers withdrew, following the Spanish-American War in 1898, there was essentially an economic empire established across the Caribbean. 1903 treaty with Cuba. Teddy Roosevelt's "Speak Softly, Carry a Big Stick," building that Panama Canal. The U.S. enforced hegemony with armed interventions back in Nicaragua and Haiti. We talked about Haiti on the last season, or 2 seasons ago on the show. The U.S. did not need to use military might in Guatemala, where a series of dictators were willing to accommodate the economic interests of the United States in support for their regimes. And, of course, that gives the rise to, Banana Republic, where these dictators would essentially act to ensure the property rights of this the property rights of these American companies, whether it be Dole or, in Guatemala's case, United Fruit Company. One of these biggest kind of concessions and really just ways of support for the United States, and especially United States fruit companies, is, especially in Guatemala, is where they would literally give up in the late 19th century to, support this increased demand for coffee at the time. They passed legislation that essentially kicked all the indigenous population out their land and allowed the coffee growers to purchase it. President Estrada Cabrera of Guatemala from 1898 to 1920 was one of the rulers who made one of the largest concessions to foreign companies, including UFC. No, not the fighting group, but the United Fruit Company, formed in 1899, the merger of 2 large corporations. This company ate up really large parts of Latin America, and it was completely, a state within a state, the deep state, the shadow government, whatever you want to hear about, people talking about today, all this kind of craziness. It is pretty clear that at one time in history that model existed, and that time in history was in Guatemala in the early 1900s. Eventually, this rapid dispossession, especially in the context of the global Great Depression, began to make the people of Guatemala feeling a little bit rebellious. They had an uprising around the 1930s, and that really made, because, there were some wealthy Guatemalan landowners from kind of the colonial days. You got United Fruit Company in there as well, and it really came time to pick somebody strong and really just back them, just go hard for them. And that person was going to be Jorge Ubico. He won an uncontested election in 1931, and he became essentially Hitler Southwest. He literally was an admirer of Hitler and Mussolini, but had to ally with the U.S. because Hitler, and Mussolini at the time weren't really interested in sending money to a small Latin American country while they're fighting World War II. And this, he really went hard on the indigenous population. No more debt peonage now. You can just be forced labor, just be a cog in the machine for at least 100 days if you owe debt to one of these large American companies. He authorized landowners to take any actions they wished against their workers, including executions. And obviously, he was a staunch anti-communist. Meanwhile, UFC, United Fruit Company, was growing up the wazoo, become the largest landowner and employer in Guatemala for several years by 1930. The government had been granted a new contract that was immensely favorable to the company. That included giving it 200,000, or 490,000 acres of public land, an exemption from all taxes, and a guarantee that no other company would receive any competing contract, especially signing over the rights of their company, of their country to this United Fruit Company, giving up large portions of land, just taking away any and all kind of legal protections against the company, against the influence the company may have over not even just the people of the country, but the government by and large. Ubico requests the UFC to cap the daily salary of its workers at 50 U.S. cents, so that workers in other companies would be able to demand, or would not be able to demand, higher and any kind of higher wages. So, essentially saying, if you own or employ a large lead, a large plurality of people in my country, you got to pay them at a specific amount, so the other ones don't get too excited, essentially. This really made people more and more annoyed, and university students, actually, and middle-class citizens, probably because they feared they would be kind of caught up next in the meat grinder of Jorge Ubico's government, led a popular uprising, which caused Ubico to flee the country and hand power over to a 3-person junta who continued the policies of Ubico until it was toppled again by the October Revolution that aimed to transform Guatemala into a liberal democracy. This led to an election, one of the first really actually fair elections that we've seen in Guatemala, and it led to the election of a guy named Juan Jose Arevalo, who was a pretty conservative university professor, but kind of being from that educated middle-class milieu, did feel the need to kind of liberalize Guatemala's rules a bit. They drafted a more liberal labor code, really hard to see how it could get any worse, built health centers, and increased funding to education. Some of his other policies included minimum wage, state-run farms to kind of employ landless laborers, and, he also, at the same time, did the classic concede to the left, but also crack down on more far-left elements type of move. He really shut out the Guatemalan Party of Labor, the Communist Guatemalan Party of Labor, or the PGT, and criminalized all labor unions in workplaces with fewer than 500 workers. Kind of great kind of concede, but hold off some of the more radical energy move. We've seen that, a lot of times throughout kind of liberal politics throughout history. By 1947, the remaining unions had grown strong enough to pressure him into drafting a new labor code, which made workplace discrimination illegal and created health and safety standards for the first time. But one of the big issues that really began, especially as we saw United Fruit Company and all these colonial landowners just eating up so much of the Guatemalan land, the big issue, the big bugaboo on everyone's lips, some of the more radical people were definitely pushing this, but it was kind of almost taboo at the time, was land reform, which Arevalo refused to support of any kind, and really did not change any of the kind of countryside labor relations. Despite these crackdowns, however, the United States, of course, being the lovely country that it is, due to the fact that Arevalo wasn't just locking up all dissenting leaders, including communists and leaders of the teachers' unions, and actually allowed them to leave prison. Of course, he was under Soviet influence and a possible communist in disguise, according to the United States. It was really kind of representative of how any sort of push, even an incredibly moderate and kind of politically moderate push for social liberation and just economic and social independence in Latin America, will really be met with so much resistance by not only just the United States, but the powers that be. Is, another big thing is, he had the support for this Caribbean League, which one of the members included Fidel Castro. But he was one of the people in this group that was essentially just a pretty broad-based group that was aimed at just getting United States interests and out of Latin America, kind of progressive exiles and revolutionaries, essentially, who aimed to overthrow these dictatorships. And the government faced opposition as well from both the United States and within the country, where 25 coup attempts were made at this guy, who again stopped any kind of land reform and was actually cracked down on kind of left-wing political dissent as well, and should have been if the United States were smart, a pretty good hand to kind of guide Guatemala into independence in a way that they really could control and be comfortable with. But that was not something that they were really in at all. A notable attempt was led by Francisco Arana, who was actually part of that three-man junta that was kind of kicked out by the democratic election of Arevalo. But that was actually foiled in an armed shootout between Arana supporters and a force led by Arevalo's defense minister, none other than Jacobo Arbenz. Arana was among those killed, but the details of the coup were never made public. Other sources of opposition to Arevalo's government were right-wing politicians and conservatives with the military, but also the Catholic Church. Again, it was election time come 1950, and that was the time for the very popular defense minister, again, Jacobo Arbenz, to secure victory. He was a kind of pretty interesting guy. He was definitely to the more left wing of the kind of tradition. I guess you could call it Arevaloismo, I guess is what how they call different political philosophies and then or political movements or groups in Latin America. He was definitely towards the left wing of the cabinet of Arevalo and his administration, but one key thing was, it caused a lot of people to worry, was he was associated with the PGT. That was the kind of the Communist Party. But the key thing is here, and again, another one, what is in my view, people may disagree, but it's one of the missed chances if you're kind of looking at this smartly from the United States point of view is, here's a guy we can actually get to moderately bring Guatemala into the, kind of under, independence, bring it under its own self-control and put it under government that we don't have to worry about, falling susceptible to the Soviet Union, because, he was explicitly anti-communist, not in any kind of rabid way, but he was, okay, I'm a capitalist, I'm doing kind of relatively moderate capitalist approach, but mainly, by and large, I just want my country to be run independently, which, a relatively simple deal, even though he did have some of the PGT members in there. The PGT, also, a pretty big, important deal is Arbenz was really able to get the PGT to kind of come back into the system, kind of getting rid of its outlaw nature, but also some of its kind of more militaristic, radical tendencies, and getting it much more under the control and under the discipline of the kind of Guatemalan state and legal structure. So the most prominent component of Arbenz's policy was his agrarian reform bill, land reform. Arbenz drafted the bill himself, having sought advice from economists across Latin America. The focus of the law was on transferring uncultivated land from large landowners to poor laborers who would then begin to build viable farms of their own. That bill, Decree 900. It was a pretty big deal at the time. It expropriated all uncultivated land from landholdings that were larger than 673 acres. If the estates were between 224 acres and 672 acres, uncultivated land must be expropriated only if less than two-thirds of it was in use. The owners were compensated with government bonds, the value of which was equal to that of the land expropriated. The value of the land itself was what owners had declared it to be in the tax returns of 1952. Of nearly all 350,000 private landholdings, only 350,000 total, only 1,710 would be affected by expropriation. The law was implemented with great speed, which resulted in some arbitrary land seizures. There was some violence directed at landowners, though, as well as at peasants who had minor land holdings. It drove people crazy. Some of those people were the United Fruit Company. No surprise. Their annual profits were $65 million at the time in 1950. Again, that is more than $800 million, $818 million today. The company was the largest landowner by far in Guatemala, owning the main port, the only port in Guatemala to the Atlantic Ocean, allowing them to even make profits from the flow of goods through the port. They were viewed pretty skeptically, understandably, by some of the Guatemalan revolutionaries, and really through some of their own discriminatory labor policies against the native population. The reforms of Arevalo's government affected the UFC more than other companies owing to its really massive size. Again, this is a relatively moderate new labor code that was passed. The new labor code saw UFC workers allowed to strike when their demands for higher wages and job security were not met. The company saw itself as specifically being targeted by the reforms, refusing to negotiate with numerous sets of strikers despite frequently being in violation of their laws. Decree 900, though, was a big step in the wrong direction for them. This was something where, okay, not only do the workers have to strike, or can they strike? We can kind of just ignore them. It's fine. We can kind of work past them just because we're such a big behemoth and we have so much power, kind of both physical and monetary, and also really some soft power over the kind of Guatemalan government. But now we are actually going to have to give up some of that physical power. We're going to have to give up some of that land. So obviously, what do? Called up their friends in the U.S. government, lobbied them quite intensely, and some of the U.S. congressmen were even pretty pissed at the fact that, hey, Guatemala wasn't acting in the best interests of one American company. American historians observed that, quote, to the Guatemalans, it appeared that their country was being mercilessly exploited by foreign interests which took huge profits without making any contribution to the nation's welfare. Crazy for them to even get that idea. In 1953, 200,000 acres of uncultivated land was expropriated by the government, which offered the company compensation at the rate of $2.99 US dollars to the acre. That's $7.39 US dollars per hectare. Twice what the company had paid when it bought the property. They were getting a good deal. Again, this was not some kind of Mao or Pol Pot, kill all landlords, send them to the field, send them to gulags, whatever. They were literally offering to buy out in any way the United States here. They just wanted them out. They wanted them gone. They wanted to start their own country. And this was just fundamentally unacceptable. This was a kind of untenable claim for them, the Guatemalan government was like, okay, we'll offer you the valuation of what you say the land was valuated at for tax purposes, which obviously the United Fruit Company completely undervalued their land for tax purposes. The company was, again, quite unhappy with its compensation, resulting in further lobbying, particularly through, again, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, who had close ties to the company. They also began a public relations campaign to discredit the Guatemalan government, hiring Edward Bernays, who managed a concerted misinformation campaign for several years, which portrayed the company as the victim of a communist Guatemalan government. Again, despite the fact that the company essentially owned every single other Guatemalan government and a large majority of land, including the only ports of the frickin' Atlantic, at that time. This included commissioning research study from a firm known to be hostile to social reform, producing a 235-page report that was highly critical of the Guatemalan government. Historians have stated that the report was full of exaggerations, scurrilous depictions, and bizarre historical theories, but had a pretty big impact on the members of Congress who read it, kind of really, highlighting to them, this is a problem. And again, even though, by all accounts, Arbenz just really wanted to pay out and buy out American influence in the region, it became clear, at least to the people reading this report in the United States Congress, that there was a problem and something needed to be done. This was the beginning of the Cold War period, and things needed to get done. There was arms and kind of fights that needed to be traded and battles to be won. One of the big kind of dynamics here in this situation was, as the Latin American region was getting more independent, the United States naturally started losing some of their friends in that area. That was all kind of a little bit perked up. People in the government, United States government, turned that frown of theirs upside down back in April 1952 when Anastasio Somoza Garcia, who was then the kind of dictator in Nicaragua, some would say the Ubico of Nicaragua, at the time was in the United States for his first state visit, and he, I think, was at the UN, he was in New York City, and met with Truman and senior staff, and kind of give a wink and a nudge to say, if the United States gave him the arms and him the power, he would clean up Guatemala. It kind of fell on deaf ears a little bit early on, but Truman kind of instructed the CIA to kind of look into it a little bit more. They also contacted Carlos Castillo Armas, a Guatemalan army officer who had been exiled from the country in 1949 following a failed coup attempt against President Arevalo. It was one of the 25 that tried to take him out, believing Castillo Armas would lead a coup with or without their assistance, and assigning to want to get there, get in on what could be a pretty successful venture and kind of get in on the good side with probably what could be the next Guatemalan government. They said, okay, we are in. They apparently considered Castillo Armas sufficiently corrupt and authoritarian to be well-suited to lead this coup and stand in as another strong man that the elite of Guatemala, both in the country and abroad, could support easily. The coup was planned in detail over the next weeks by the CIA, UFC, and Somoza. The CIA also contacted Marcos Perez Jimenez of Venezuela and Rafael Trujillo of Dominican Republic. And those two guys kind of got in on it as well. The operation was called PBF Fortune. It was officially approved on September 9th, 1952. But the various planning steps had taken place well before earlier that year. In January 1952, the CIA's Directorate of Plans compiled a top flight communist list, whom the government would desire to eliminate immediately in the event of a successful anti-communist coup. Essentially, saying these people have to, be quote unquote disappeared if we are going to be successful about this. The plan was kind of terminated soon after, as they're going to put the plan into motion. This plan was a freighter that had been borrowed from the UFC. It was kind of especially refitted in New Orleans and stocked up. They said, we're just doing some agricultural refittings, just so can kind of carry more bananas, I guess, is what we're trying to go with. But no, it was actually with weapons. So they get in there, and they kind of get discovered because the State Department discovered the plan when a senior official was asked to sign a certain document, while others suggest that Samoa's was indiscreet at the time. It was a bit of a finger-pointing situation, but it eventually did not work. Then Secretary of State Dean Acheson called off the operation. And the CIA, though, continued to support Castillo Armas, the general at the time in Guatemala who was anti-Arbenz. They paid him a monthly retainer of $3,000 US, which today, fun fact, would be worth about $37,000 a month. Meanwhile, as Eisenhower gave way to Truman, he was pledging to pursue a more proactive policy to kind of roll back communism rather than the simple containment strategy, working on an increasing atmosphere of McCarthyism in government circles. Some would argue McCarthyism was a big factor in kind of what took out Truman in a really big way, especially during the course of the Korean War. Although PBF Fortune had been quickly aborted, tension between the U.S. and Guatemala continued to arise. So this kind of new, increasing Red Scare dynamic was what really caused people to revisit things. Again, we talked about it. How many times are these people's names going to come up in the season? Answer is a lot. The Dulles brothers, John Foster, Secretary of State, and his brother, CIA Director Alan Dulles, had close ties to the UFC. They had been partners at the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell and had arranged several deals from the UFC in that capacity. Undersecretary of State Walter Bedell Smith would later become a director at the company, while Eisenhower's personal assistant, Nancy Whitman, was the wife of the public relations director, Edward Whitman, at UFC. So it probably essentially had big dinners, you can imagine, at the White House when they talk about this, plan it, and, just imagine what life would be like with a completely communist-free Guatemala, at least in their eyes. And fresh off of the 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh, Eisenhower was kind of feeling his oats a little bit and decided, really, in the context of, again, you got the Red Scare being increasingly kind of being pushed, McCarthy rising to increasing prominence and McCarthyism rising to increasing prominence, Americans being, really scared about Soviets and communism and all that. Also, as we mentioned, Eisenhower's and his administration and key figures in his administration's close ties to the key members of the United Fruit Company. And, also kind of the feeling that, yes, they could do this. This was a possible and probable, likely good outcome, especially after Iran. This operation was, kind of fast-tracked a little bit and really begun planning, now under a new name, PB Success. It's time to meet the team. The State Department created a team of diplomats who would support PB Success. It was led by John Purifoy, who took over as ambassador to Guatemala in October 1953. Another member of the team was William D. Pauley, a wealthy businessman and diplomat with a pretty extensive knowledge of the aviation industry. Purifoy was a militant anti-communist and had proven his willingness to work with the CIA during his time as U.S. ambassador to Greece. Under Purifoy's tenure, the relations with the Guatemalan government soured further, although those with the Guatemalan military had subsequently improved. In a report to John Dulles, Purifoy stated that he was essentially convinced that if Arbenz is not a communist, he will certainly do until one comes along. Within the CIA, the operation was headed by Deputy Director of Plans Frank Wisner. The field commander selected by Wisner was former U.S. Army Colonel Albert Haney, then chief of the CIA station in South Korea. These were veterans who knew what they were doing. Haney reported directly to Wisner, thereby separating PB's success from CIA's Latin America division, a decision which created some tension within the agency. CIA was a complicated, premature coup. Was actually complicated. The operation, the plan for the real coup, was complicated by a pretty awkward, premature coup back in, or actually really a few months before they were set to actually go ahead with the thing, which definitely made things a little bit awkward, to say the least. But it was led by kind of a futile raid against an army garrison in Salama, central Guatemalan department of Baja Verapaz. The rebellion was swiftly crushed. A number of participants were arrested, and this included several CIA agents and allies. This weakened the coup effort pretty substantially. Thus, the CIA came to rely more heavily on Guatemalan exile groups and their anti-democratic allies in Guatemala. The CIA considered several candidates to lead the coup, including Miguel Idoras Fuentes, the conservative candidate who had lost the 1950 election to Arbenz, and held favor with the Guatemalan opposition and actually had run for election. He was, though, rejected for his role in the Ubico regime, which kind of made him a poisoned kind of option or a poisoned name to lead the Guatemalan government, as the memories of that regime were still pretty fresh. Another candidate was the coffee planter, Juan Cordova Serna, who had briefly served in the Arevalo cabinet before becoming the legal advisor to the UFC. The death of his son in an anti-government uprising in 1950 turned him against the government, and he had planned another unsuccessful Salama coup. Had planned these unsuccessful Salama coup before fleeing to join Castillo Armas in exile. Although his status as a civilian gave him some advantage to really be the leader, as a kind of a military takeover wouldn't be the best look, he was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1954. So Castillo, he got his army together along with a small force of mercenaries among the Guatemalan exiles, the population of nearby countries, including got Nicaragua, Honduras as well, supplying the Dominican Republic, I believe, with some financial support, and it was time to go. Well, preparations for this was underway. Washington kind of denounced the Guatemalan government, saying it's been infiltrated by communists, and laying the groundwork for this situation. And again, another key organization that's been literally playing roles in American coups all the way up until, I believe, 2019 with the Bolivian coup. The Organization of American States was asked by the State Department to modify the agenda of the Inter-American Conference, which is going to be held in Caracas in May 1954, essentially to talk about how Guatemala was becoming communist. And the end of January 1954, the Guatemalan government published documents containing information leaked to it by a member of Castillo Armas' team who had turned against him. Lacking in original documents, the government had engaged in poor forgery to enhance the information it possessed, undermining the credibility of its charges. And again, this may have been a kind of public relations war, but the mistake really that the Arbenz government made was not taking some of this information given to it by the leaker in the Castillo Armas camp at all seriously. How would that information come to pass, come to light, come to be used? Find out next week. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes part one of our Hidden History episode, Bitter Fruit, How the U.S. Destroyed Guatemalan Democracy. Next week, we can get into all of the details about everything related to the day of action, what followed, how, Arbenz, kind of got scared out of resisting, and the 40 years that preceded it or kind of followed it, of violence, disappearing of civilians, and a lot of generals leading the country up until about the 1990s. So, that's all next week. Well, I had to break it down for you. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. This has been Hidden History.